Okay, we are rolling. Beth Lambert, welcome to the Terrain Theory podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Beth, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I was a healthcare consultant. I worked for pharmaceutical, medical device companies, hospital systems, that sort of thing. Became profoundly disillusioned with that industry, kind of left and went a little soul searching and decided to become a teacher for a little while. And in that process, I also started a family. And when I had my first two children, I became aware of a massive epidemic of chronic illness in our children. My own children had, soft signs of being affected, had all kinds of health symptoms, like the kinds of things that you didn't really have a diagnosis for, but you still needed to address. And so, in that search for what might have been causing symptoms, I really started getting into an understanding of what was happening in our environment that was affecting our children's health. So, I was in grad school at that time when I dove into that, and I wrote a book called The Compromised Generation that looks at the environment and how it impacts our children's health and wellness and development. That was the time when I became aware of this massive epidemic of autism, ADHD, autoimmune diseases in kids. These were things that showed up later in life for adults who had spent an entire lifetime smoking and drinking and, just living the good life and not taking care of themselves. But we had a whole generation of kids that were developing chronic illnesses. So clearly there's something in the environment that was causing it. So this became basically the focus of the rest of my life. So after I wrote that book, I kind of realized people don't read books anymore. So there's other ways that you have to reach people. So I founded a nonprofit organization called Epidemic Answers. And that was meant to do just that, find answers to this epidemic of chronic health conditions in our children. And I just have been on a tear since then. And part of the reason I've been on a tear, not just to raise awareness about what's happening to our kids, but also to shift the paradigm in how we think about chronic illness. And that most people think of chronic illness as genetic, something you're stuck with. There's not much you can do about it aside from like symptom suppressive pharmaceuticals. But that is not the case. Kids recover from these conditions all the time, including conditions like autism. It's just not part of the conventional medical dialogue. Like people aren't talking about that. It's not part of the narrative about what happens when you get a diagnosis. So it's been my mission since I learned that kids could recover from these conditions to help parents find the resources they need to reverse these conditions in their children, and even more to prevent them in the first place, because that's possible as well.
And that's one of the topics and questions that we're gonna cover. And although Epidemic Answers, as we talked about, as you already mentioned, addresses the myriad chronic health conditions that afflict children in the U.S., we want to focus this episode on autism because it's part of our series around Autism Awareness Month. And so I was on Autism Speaks, and they state that right now 1 in 36 children in the U.S. have autism, but you cite a JAMA study on one of your websites that puts it closer to 1 in 30. And one of our questions is, in your opinion, what is causing the increase in autism rates in the U.S.? Because they've skyrocketed over the last 50 plus years.
Yeah, and also it depends on what study you look at. Like the CDC saying it's 1 in 36, and we looked at the statistics, and it depends on if you're looking at California or Utah or New Jersey, or where are you looking, because some places are more impacted with kids with autism than others. Even if you just look at the developed world versus the developing world, the places that are more industrial have more autism. So what's that about?
Yeah.
So what I think is going on is that autism is kind of the microcosm of the macrocosm. It is the symbol of what we are doing to our bodies as human beings on planet Earth in 2024. So we are living in a way that is totally disconnected from the way that humans have lived for thousands and thousands of years. We are no longer living in sync with nature. Everything that we do is synthetic, from the food that we eat to the things we put on our skin to the light that we are surrounded by every day. It's all artificial. And you can't tell me that way of living is not going to impact our health. So you could talk about heart disease or diabetes or all these things that we commonly think about as health issues. But when you're talking about children who are impacted by all these synthetic, chemical, toxic things that are going into their bodies, and you talk about that assaulting them during critical developmental times, from 0 to 3 years old, you're doing a whole lot of development. You're learning to see, you're learning to hear, you're learning to process all this stimulus in your brain, you're learning to walk and talk, you're learning to read nuanced cues from people, from humans who are like incredibly complex beings. And all the while, you're dealing with a toxic assault that's causing inflammation in your body, right? You're dealing with maybe a child had 6, 7 rounds of antibiotics in the first couple of years of life, which is not uncommon. So an assault like that totally disrupts their developmental trajectory, because everything that you do, what happens when you take an antibiotic, is related to your ability to digest and take nutrients in. It's related to your ability to detoxify. It's related to your ability to produce neurotransmitters. So we're living this modern industrial life and asking babies to develop along their normal trajectory when that's absolutely an impossible thing to do. So when you see all these developmental conditions like autism and ADHD, learning disabilities, also other conditions that might, normally have been considered genetic, like something, even Down syndrome as an example, that's chromosomal, like you cannot change the chromosomal situation. Those kids are faring worse developmentally because of the burden on their bodies than they would have otherwise been had they not been living in the toxic modern industrial world. So the way I describe what causes autism, it's the total load, it's a cumulative and synergistic effect of living in the modern world and all the many stressors that these children have on their bodies that affect them during critical developmental times. So you can have that same toxic load on a 30-year-old that already had the chance to go through their normal developmental timeline unimpeded. And that 30-year-old is going to develop an autoimmune disease or depression or anxiety, or they're going to develop arthritis, or something that is more about inflammation and more about the body trying to get rid of the toxins and the stressors. But you do that on a baby, that child's going to get a developmental condition. And so that's bad news. But the good news in all this is that human beings are incredibly resilient. There's neuroplasticity, this whole science of how the brain changes depending on stimulus. And we know that children can actually overcome these developmental conditions by reducing that total load, giving the body the ability to heal, and then revisiting those developmental milestones. So people actually lose their autism diagnosis all the time. It's very hotly debated because there is a predominant narrative right now that autism is genetic and it's brain-based, and there's nothing you can do about it. Autism is a whole body condition that develops due to a total load of environmental stressors, and we can do something about it.
Can you dive into the total load a little bit? I think I'll speak for both Mike and I that we agree that we are subject, living in the modern world, to assaults of all kinds. And you're speaking our language when you say that we're not living in alignment with nature, and that would be what we would call a root cause to the chronic illness that we see that is widespread, not just in the United States, but across the world. But I do want to see if we can start to tease out some of the bigger contributors. Like when you talk about toxic load, you mentioned like synthetics, but in your research and in your experience, are there some bigger ones that we really need to be aware of?
Yes. So I mentioned that I founded a nonprofit organization, and several years into reaching out to parents and trying to educate them about all these chronic health conditions. And we're also trying to reach pediatricians and physicians. We really understood that we were lacking a body of science that measured the total load of living in the modern world and how it would affect children's health. So we decided to raise some money and do our own science. So we started a project called Documenting Hope. We have 2 IRB approved studies in that project right now. One is a study called the CHIRP study, and that stands for Child Health Inventory for Resilience and Prevention. And what that study is the largest environmental health survey that we know of that looks at all the things that children are exposed to in the course of their life, really even going back, multi-generational. So you could have things that impacted grandma, like, maybe grandma was a victim of racism or abuse, and grandpa was had some kind of war torture in his background. That's all epigenetic stuff that can affect progeny. So we wanted to get basically build a database of the most comprehensive set of environmental factors that we could, and then look at those factors and see how that correlates with health outcomes. So we launched this study in 2018, and we've been collecting data ever since. We've had about 2,000 parents enroll in the study. About 500 have completed the survey. The survey takes between 4 and 6 hours to complete. It's a major, major undertaking. But we really want to know everything about that child, like right down to the brand of toothpaste that the child's using. How many hours does the child spend outside? Does the child's feet ever touch the ground, the earth? Like literally everything that you could think of that might impact a child's health positively or negatively, we ask the questions. And so we've done some analysis. It's preliminary right now. We don't have enough data to say anything conclusively or publish, but we're continuing to gather data. And what we have found, a couple of key insights. One, total load is a real thing. Like we have demonstrated that total load is actually scientifically provable. Potentially, again, our data set's small, but what we've seen in that data set is that the more stressors a child has, the worse the health outcomes, or the more complicated. So the kids who have, the most number of stressors, again, starting from neonatal, preconception, all the way through, the more complicated their conditions. They're going to have the neurodevelopmental, neurobehavioral type conditions. Then the other major finding we've had is the single most impactful negative health stressor across all diagnostic categories is antibiotic exposure. So we're talking about antibiotics that mom had, because if mom has antibiotics, it affects her microbiome. And when she is pregnant and then delivers, that microbiome is transferred to the baby vaginally. If the baby's born by a C-section, which is more than a third of babies in this country, that baby's getting the microbiome of the delivery room. So they're not even getting the vaginal flora from mom. So that's a disruption to the microbiome. The microbiome is so critical for development. It's so critical for health, like your immune system. Why do we have so many allergies? Why do we have so many people that are reactive to things in our environment? Like all of a sudden, everyone's allergic to mold. That isn't about the mold necessarily, although mold's a major, major issue. It is about the microbiome and our capacity to tolerate. Our immune system can't tolerate things that we're exposed to in the environment anymore. So whether you're looking at, a child who has allergies, ADHD, autism, rheumatoid arthritis, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. Antibiotics are showing up as a major signal in their history. And if you look at our culture, we are like the antibiotic culture. I mean, not just like, mom taking it for sinus infections or, for every virus, that even though antibiotics don't work against viruses, we're taking it for that. But about 40% of women test positive for group beta strep in the United States, which is a vaginal swab they do right before birth just to make sure that the baby isn't going to get exposed to group beta strep. And what do? If mom tests positive, mom goes on IV antibiotics during labor. And typically, oftentimes, baby will get exposure to antibiotics because of that group beta strep protocol. 40% of babies in the United States, that's a hospital protocol that is wiping out the microbiome of American babies. That alone is major. Then you have sort of the cascade of immune issues that triggers ear infections and gut issues that results in more rounds of antibiotics. The throat stuff, the tonsils get swollen. Like it's just a parade of antibiotics in the modern American child. So that is, again, common across diagnostic categories. Like we think so siloed. We're like, what causes autism or what causes allergies? It's actually the same set of variables. It's just to what degree, at what time, and how resilient was the child at the time of the exposure. And what did the child do after the exposure? So that was a major, antibiotics was a major factor. Another one is toxins, like chemical exposures. We've done this way of analyzing our data where we combine the chemical exposures into indices so that we can sort of look at their total effect. And chemical exposures are major across diagnostic categories. Two more categories that I'll mention. And like the thing is about, we're measuring all these environmental factors, it all matters. At the end of the day, it all matters, but some perhaps more significantly so than others.
Sorry to interrupt. I mean, you think about like the straw that broke the camel's back. Well, you might blame that one straw, but it's all the accumulation of all those straws that breaks the camel's back. It makes complete sense. Sorry, I just wanted to dive real quick. When you say toxins, can you speak a little bit more in detail about what kind of toxins?
Yeah. So we created indices that pile all of the modern toxins that people are typically exposed to into a group, and then we measure that against the health outcomes. So we're looking at everything from fluoride in toothpaste
Mm.
to fragrances that are ubiquitous in the modern American lifestyle. So fragrance Yankee candles and your fragrance laundry detergent and perfumes and other things like dry cleaning. Toxins might include heavy metals, like exposures that you might have had to mercury, cadmium, aluminum. Like we ask questions like, does your child play with jewelry from China, because there's likely heavy metal exposures in there.
Mhm.
It's really, if you think about the number of synthetic things that are in a child's life, you can kind of pick out the products, like the consumer products, and you can read the label and you can ascertain that there's chemicals there. But people don't even think about the stuff that's in their daily life, like their couches and how their couches are sprayed with Scotchgard, the flame retardants that are put into children's pajamas, the building materials we're using in the monorail. We ask about when the house was built. What kinds of materials was the house made of? So there's an endless list of chemicals, and at the end of the day, it's kind of like, you know, how do you know what you're exposed to? Well, how in rhythm with nature do you live? Do you use more natural products or do you use more synthetic and chemical products? So it's really just an unending list of chemicals that we're surrounded by every day.
Got it. Oh, and I didn't mean to derail. So antibiotics was one, toxins another.
Yeah. Another index that came up surprisingly high, we're all a little surprised by this. We know the science behind it, but we were surprised to see it show up in our data, and that was electromagnetic radiation exposure.
Mm.
So that did we didn't expect it to have signal, because I always think of it. I mean, despite the data that's out there, like it can stimulate the immune system the way that a toxin might. And there's plenty of data showing how it disrupts mitochondrial health and metabolism and all kinds of other things. But kids who had high exposure to Wi-Fi, EMF device exposure had worse health outcomes. Like that's just sort of, again, it's a small data set, but EMF, EMR is showing in our data as significant. So that's something that most people aren't thinking about at all, especially in this digital age when, every kid's walking around with an iPad or, a cell phone. It's something that we really need to be thinking about.
And you're getting that data because you're surveying them with questions and asking about their usage of such technology. How deep do you go to learn more about EMF exposure in those questions? Like, what can you give us an example of some of those questions you're asking?
Yeah. So we would say, how many hours does a child spend on an iPad, on a tablet, on a cell phone, and down to like half-hour increments, 15-minute increments? How many times a day is the child using the device before bed? Because we know that exposure to blue light from the devices disrupts the melatonin and their ability to sleep. We ask about proximity to Wi-Fi router. Do you have Wi-Fi, or is your house hardwired? Not that many people have hardwire, but I do. But the Wi-Fi router close to the child's head is happening more than you would think. So like, your Wi-Fi router is in the same room as the kid's bedroom or right behind their bedroom. Smart devices. So like ovens and dishwashers and, clothes dryers are all smart devices now, and they're all emitting. And one of the things that we found, which was really interesting, the other study that we are running, I didn't mention, is called the FLIGHT study. And that stands for Facilitated Longitudinal Intensive Investigation of Genuine Health Transformation, which is a mouthful. But what it is an intervention study. And the study was designed because we know that these environmental factors are affecting kids' health. This total load is kind of the root cause of these children's health issues. So our hypothesis was, well, what if we reduce the total load for these children, try to eliminate as many of the environmental stressors as possible, and then we try and help support their health with nutrition and with specific supplementation that they might need, different kinds of therapies they might need. What happens to their health? So we started this study in 2021. We have 2 children that were enrolled in this study, and we are planning to enroll more children in the coming months. One child has autism. The other child has alopecia universalis. That's an autoimmune disease. He has no hair on his body, no eyelashes, no eyebrows, no hair on his skin, nothing. And the reason I brought this up is because we found in the second child, the child with alopecia universalis, a major electrical exposure that was very likely the straw that broke the camel's back for this child. So in our study, the way it's designed is we come into their home, we do a full biobiology, international building biology inspection, just to see what is going on in their home, like what exposures might there be? Are there smart devices? Is there mold? Is there lead paint that's chipping off? Like, what kinds of things can we mitigate in this home? So when we had the inspector come in, series of inspectors come in to look at this child's home, they found in his bedroom an electrical field exposure that was 600 times the safe limit. So what we learned after doing further history on this child was that so when he was 3 years old, he suddenly lost all of his hair in clumps. He had normal head of hair and eyelashes and all the things, and it just started falling out in clumps suddenly. It was right around the time that his baby sister was born. So of course the parents were like, is this stress of the baby sister coming in? What's going on? So it turns out that this boy moved from his parents' bedroom into his big boy bedroom at 3 years old, into his new big boy bed, right next to the electrical field exposure. So right next to his head, there was faulty wiring that wasn't grounded, and that was creating this dangerous electrical exposure for him. And all of his hair started falling out. This child enrolled in our program when he was 8 years old. He hadn't had any hair on his head from 3 to 8. So he's been in our program. We've removed the electrical field exposure. We've been trying to support him nutritionally and in other ways. He has regrown eyelashes, eyebrows. He's starting to get little wisps of hair on his head. And he used to have major behavioral issues where he would just be so grumpy in the morning and tired and kind of tantrum in the morning. All of that has resolved since they cut the electrical exposure. So again, it's not like that's the only thing. But for this child, that was a major stressor on his body. And it was a silent, hidden one, right? So how many people are thinking about their child? Yeah, like there's probably an electrical exposure in that wall there. There's probably faulty wiring. Nobody's thinking that. You need to have an inspector come in and do that. But the point for this story to me is if your child has alopecia, rheumatoid arthritis, or has ulcerative colitis, or has autism, or whatever your child has, dig deeper. Look for the environmental factors. Like, what is this child exposed to? What is this child's total load? And what kinds of things can we do to reduce that total load and see if those symptoms start to resolve?
Mm-hmm.
It's important not to oversimplify this stuff, but in a sense, it's organic versus synthetic is the oversimplification.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more than organic versus, well, I guess it depends on how you define that, but yeah, it's what you said earlier. It's living in rhythm with nature. Like, why do we think that for, hundreds of thousands of years, human beings have lived outdoors in sync with nature, gone to bed when the sun went down, got up when the sun came up, touched the earth every day, dealt with the earth every day, ate food that came out of the earth, was not processed. Like, what makes us think we can change all that in the span of like 150 to 200 years and be fine? Like, it's fine to do it all synthetically now. Like, with the arrogance and the hubris around that, like, we've just completely lost the respect that we should have for just what it means to be a part of nature. And that's, our health is failing as a result of it. So that's just sort of the warning sign. But yes, as to your point, like natural, synthetic, like pick one, and then you're going to pick your health path.
Yeah. And I guess to the three of us, this is relatively self-evident at this point because we've been steeped in this work for X amount of years. And I imagine families that you're working with are looking for solutions if they're aligned with you at this point. But do you must find resistance to some of these ideas? It just doesn't occur to them that this could be problematic because it's just been so normalized. So many of these insults,
right? Absolutely. And I got into this work, interestingly, I was a history undergrad. I did my master's degree in American studies. And people are always like, well, what does that have to do with like health and all that? Like, I don't get it. My book, A Compromised Generation, is about American culture. And
right?
It is almost impossible to live outside of American culture without feeling ostracized, separated, isolated. But all of these people who are waking up to what modern American culture is doing to our bodies are feeling that way. They're feeling like, I feel like an outsider because I don't put like synthetic whatever on my body. I feel like an outsider if I want to not vaccinate my kids, or I'm an outsider if I don't want to use pharmaceuticals, because it has been so normalized. And the medical industrial complex has a stranglehold on all of the media channels. So like, we don't know anything different, because when you get sick, you go to the doctor. The doctor gives you a pharmaceutical. The pharmaceutical was put there as part of their medical school training. Like, it is so wrapped up in our culture. We turn on the TV and what are the ads we see? They're pharmaceuticals. It's like so normalized to go with conventional Western medicine. When like, meanwhile, every other culture around the world has like 5,000 years of amazing traditions of healing that have been completely denigrated because they're like 5,000 years old. They can't possibly be like modern and, good. But that's how you heal, is by listening to the wisdom and traditions of indigenous people, of traditional Chinese medicine, of Ayurveda, like all these traditions that have all that wisdom. Western medicine has completely squashed it on purpose, right? It has a business imperative to do so. So I think that is one of our fundamental problems, is our culture is toxic. Our way of thinking of health is owned by Western conventional medicine. And so therefore it's very isolating to live in counterculture, to think of like eating organic food. It's not a fad. It's actually what people used to do, but it feels weird for people to do that because you have to step outside of our culture.
Yeah, that's well said. It's funny. Ben and I both grew up playing in bands and being sort of punky musician teens. And there's this romance about being countercultural, like, but when push comes to shove as an adult, it's no small thing to be part of the counterculture. In fact, it's a major, it's a major deal to actually embrace it and live your life and stick to your guns as a countercultural.
But I think we can grow counterculture too. I mean, I think about like the 60s and 70s was a countercultural movement that really caught on. Like, people really started breaking down the barriers of what the institutions were and what people were telling them. And it worked. Like, counterculture really pushed against that. I think our next wave of counterculture has to come with like health freedom and empowerment and like your own responsibility for your own health. Like, it is catching on. And I do think COVID, the whole experience people went through, people stopped trusting the institutions. And so there is a counterculture that's a little bit more, it's coming, but it needs some work. It needs some help.
Agreed.
Yeah. A patient cured is a patient lost, is the phrase that we hear so often. And this medical industrial complex profits off of our sickness. And so it has an interest in keeping people sick, or even increasing those rates of sickness. And with that in mind, do you feel that there's a burgeoning industry around treating autism, but not quote unquote curing it? Meaning, is there a financial interest or a business interest, an industry interest in squashing folks like yourself who are saying, actually, this is treatable and reversible?
Yeah, I mean, I think autism is extraordinarily complicated at this moment in time in terms of talking about treatment. Certainly the word cure, I never use the word cure, because I don't use that word for any condition, because cure implies like health has these like static places that you arrive at. Like, that's not like, you could resolve all your symptoms, not have a diagnosis, and then go out and drink your face off and eat pizza for a year and get your diagnosis again. Like, it's not static. So reversal, recovery, remission, those are all good words, because your health is in constant flux. So what are you doing to support it? And I think with autism, it's tricky because, you're using one word, or autism spectrum disorders, to talk about a vast set of people and conditions. So I am seeing, kids who are nonverbal, self-injurious, banging their heads, severely debilitated, who've turned their families' lives upside down. That parents can't work, that this child needs 24/7 care, that the child isn't sleeping. You're having that child put in the same bucket as an adult who's 45, who just got diagnosis and suddenly it's all making sense. I'm actually autistic, and that explains why I have social anxiety and all these kinds of things. But that 45-year-old has a job, is married, has kids, is functioning in society. Those are not the same things.
Yeah.
Yet we're using the same word to describe that. Why is that? Because we're using a subjective diagnostic for autism. There actually is a more objective diagnostic for autism that takes the markers in the blood. There's a company called BioRosa that has looked at different markers in the blood that look at oxidative stress, inflammation, different kinds of metabolic byproducts that actually correlate with autism diagnoses. And so we're getting to this place where people are beginning to think differently about autism. It isn't just a neurodivergence and neurodiversity. Well, that's certainly a piece of it. I think that does a disservice to the ones that are more severely impacted. Because if you're nonverbal and you can't toilet yourself and you're 30 years old and you need round-the-clock care, you're not neurodiverse and neurodivergent, you're sick. Yeah. And you have needs that are not being addressed. I absolutely believe we should accept and embrace people whose brains think differently. And if you're talking about that 45-year-old who has a job and kids and their brain thinks differently, and you want a label to describe that, that's great. And like, we want to embrace and accept that. But let's not put those two things in the same bucket, because they're very, very different things. I think first and foremost, if you have any symptoms, I don't care whether it's social anxiety or whether it's you're not able to speak, you need to ask yourself, what is causing this symptom? First of all, am I suffering from this symptom? If I'm not suffering, then you're fine. You're good. You're just on the spectrum of human diversity, and we do things differently, and you do you, and it's great. Awesome. But if you're suffering, I want to know what's causing that suffering. What's at the root cause? So why can't we look at our physiology and look and see what's out of balance? I guarantee you, somebody who has anxiety, depression, who has social deficits, there's going to be an imbalance in their gut bacteria. That's like the seat of our health. So if you balance that gut bacteria, you increase the diversity there, you're going to experience some of those symptoms go away. Then do we still call it autism? Like, what word do we use to describe it? So it's a muddy, murky diagnostic category. And I think we need to do better, because we are not serving people by just saying we accept autism as it is and we love them. Of course we do. We love these kids. We love these adults. We accept them, these individuals, for who they are. But we do not want to perpetuate suffering if we do not have to, if there are answers and tools today. And there are. It's just that they're not perpetuated by the mainstream media or the medical community.
That's eloquently stated, and you do a wonderful job of navigating what is a maybe called a third rail, and that is, we can accept the individual, but we're not going to accept the suffering.
Yeah. So here's a great example. There's a development of something called Spell to Communicate that's come out in the last decade or so, and this is a tool that's used to help people who are non-speakers. So, children who are old enough to be able to learn letters, and adults who have been not speaking, not able to verbalize or communicate their needs. So these would be people who would normally be dismissed as not intelligent, or who don't have capacity, or they're just so impaired that people have written them off. But these people are being taught to spell letter at a time, because autism has a motor component where you can't speak because you have a motor planning issue. You have a motor development issue. So you cannot get your lip and tongues and all the complexity of your motor function to create speech. They're being taught to use their fingers to point to letters, and they're communicating, and they are intelligent. And they're basically telling us, I'm stuck in here and I'm listening to you all dismiss me as a human being, but I've got like a college level reading level. I have intelligence beyond, but I can't communicate it. That is what is happening to these non-speakers. And that revelation has only just come out in the last few years. So just next time you see a child with autism who is not speaking, assume intelligence, assume competence. It is a motor disorder where they cannot get the speech out. So I think we need to really revamp what we're talking about when we're putting labels on people, and cannot use this word autism anymore, because it is loaded, it is fraught with misunderstanding, it is complex, and we can do better.
Beth, on that subject, there are those who claim that the increased rates of autism just reflect greater awareness or more kids getting tested, or as you say, just maybe changes to how it's diagnosed or lumping more and more people into this bucket, you can find articles that still state this is the reason for the increase in rates. What is your response to that?
Yeah, so you can it's really unbelievable that this is still an argument that autism has always been here, but you can just use common sense. And there's been epidemiological studies that have looked at the rates increasing and that are really hard to refute. But you can just use common sense. And if you now have 1 in 30 children being diagnosed with autism, do we have one and let me just clarify that further. 1 in 30 with children who have autism, where about 40% of them are severe to moderate.
Mm.
Severe to moderate has hallmarks you can see. These are kids that are often nonverbal, not going to be able to live independently. Many of them are non-speakers. Many of them have behaviors that you can identify. We're not talking about like autism in the modern sense of it, where they're saying, autism is just sort of a quirkiness or a neurodivergence. 40% are moderate to severe. So take 40% of 1 in 30 and apply that to the adult population. Are we seeing that many adults that are moderate to severe? Where are the institutions housing these people who can't live independently? It's just a lie to say that there's not that many more, it's just better diagnosis and not more frank autism cases. Like, we just know that that's not true.
Mm.
And it really does a disservice to keep saying that we're not seeing an increase, because we're going to be stuck. Like, this is going to financially bankrupt us. This is going to cripple our social structure. Who's going to care for all these people who can't live independently?
Yeah. No, it's a good point. It's holding back what folks like you are trying to do, quite frankly, because you don't have the public opinion behind it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk more about some of the success stories, the methods methods and modalities that are being used by parents to help their child reverse and treat some of these symptoms of autism.
Yeah. There are so many success stories out there, and so many of them are hidden because a lot of the parents and the children themselves, as they grow up, feel like, I don't want that label. I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want people to know that I had autism because it has stigma. I think it's good that our society is trying to remove that stigma, but it still has stigma. And typically, what happens with these stories, and I've been collecting these stories for 15 years, it's often a mom who's just bulldogs the whole thing, bird dogs the thing down, and just goes after diet and environment hard. Like, diet is usually the cornerstone of most of these stories. So what does that mean? That usually they take out all the sugars. They usually take out food sensitivities, like usually gluten, dairy, sometimes corn and soy, and they work on rebuilding that gut microbiome. That's such a critical part of autism. And there's so much in the medical literature about microbiome being all out of whack in autism, just being less diverse, overgrowth of pathogenic microbes. So those parents typically address that with diet, because diet's accessible and it's something you can do every day and doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. It is more expensive to buy organic foods, and it's a little more expensive to eat gluten-free, perhaps, or dairy-free, but they do it and they heal these kids' guts. And that's like the first step. One of the things with autism is, again, it's a spectrum. And so you hear some stories where mom just went gluten-free, casein-free, took the whole family down this diet journey, and the kid got better, lost his diagnosis, and wow, that sounded easy. It is that easy for some people, but that's not for everybody. What happens with autism, as I was mentioning before, is that there's a total load. It happens during the developmental time. So these families are adjusting the diet, they're taking those toxins out, they're reducing that total load, but sometimes you need to do rehabilitative work. So if you kind of think about somebody who's had a stroke and how they need rehabilitation, the brain needs rehabilitation, it's not dissimilar, except for it's the other end of the life spectrum. And so you have kids who might have had like a vaccine injury that caused, inflammation in the brain, or you might have had kids who were on 3 rounds of antibiotics when they were supposed to be talking, and that part of the brain didn't develop the way it was supposed to. So you need to go back and do repair work. And there's tons of amazing therapies out there that do that. There's vision therapy. And vision therapy is incredibly important for kids with autism, because vision is the system in your body that sequesters the most energy when you're developing. And so a lot of kids with autism have vision issues. They have all kinds of developmental vision issues. So there's a whole field called developmental optometry that does that rehabilitative work. And it can be profound, because if you can take the stress off the visual system, that gives the body more capacity to do that healing and repair work. Tons and tons of therapies out there. And on our websites, we have a YouTube channel that's at Documenting Hope, and it has success stories that people can, there's a bunch of autism ones on there in particular. And then on our websites, we have I think 80 success stories that people can read about. And there's tons of them out there, and we keep collecting them and documenting as many as we can.
It's kind of amazing how many options do exist, especially because people like you are championing them and making people aware. It seems like detox is sort of first and foremost what we need to be addressing, which again seems self-evident. But what other modalities have you seen success with? You just spoke about like vision, which didn't even occur to me. What about homeopathy and things along those lines?
So homeopathy, I use it myself. I'm a fan. I use it as I trained myself as an amateur homeopath to try and figure out how to use it in my daily life. I have documented stories that homeopathy has been a profound impact. There's a whole branch of homeopathy called homotoxicology. And that actually is my preferred way of detoxing. I used it with my own family, my own kids. And it's an extremely gentle way of nudging the body to open up the emunctories, the detox pathways, to help channel the toxins out of the body. And there's a practitioner in New York City who's really well known for this. It's a growing field, but in Europe, there is a whole discipline called German New German New Medicine.
Yeah.
German New Medicine. And there's a bioregulatory medicine is another field of medicine that uses homotoxicology to help the body detox. Again, I think it can be a very powerful tool, but it's not super accessible to people, and it's not something most people know about. But it's a wonderful therapy. Another really important therapy, especially for kids with autism and anybody with anxiety or depression or mental health issues, is using the polyvagal theory and working on the vagus nerve and helping to regulate the nervous system. So if you think about these kids, again, going through that developmental trajectory, and they're getting these assaults, we as parents are like going through our lives and not seeing it as stressful, but the body sees the toxic assaults as stressful, right? And that puts that body into a state of fight or flight. And sometimes these kids get stuck there, and they're like literally metabolically so out of whack that they just get stuck in the sympathetic state in the nervous system. And one of the things that can be most profoundly helpful for these kids in terms of a therapy are various listening therapies and different kinds of breathing techniques and other things that help regulate the nervous system to bring them back into that parasympathetic so that their body goes into that rest and digest and that state of healing. But you can't necessarily get into that state of healing unless you first regulate that nervous system. So we have tons of therapies on our website, epidemicanswers.org. We've just been cataloging them. We do webinars with experts who do these different therapies, and every kid's going to need something different. So the one thing I see that's not a mistake, but I see is very common where a lot of people waste time and energy, is that they think that there's like the one doctor, like a functional medicine doctor, or this like great autism doctor who treats kids biomedically, and that doctor is going to solve all my kids' problems. They're going to run a lot of labs and figure out what's going on biochemically. At the end of the day, the person that's most important in this journey besides the child is a parent. And the parent, once they get into like a state of observation with their child and intuition with their child, they are the ones who know what their child's needs. They know what the symptoms are. They know what the assaults were, and they're going to be the best one to navigate the many therapies that are out there. And there are so many therapies out there.
Yeah, much like you said earlier, there's no quote unquote cure, because there's no magic bullet either. Because to have a cure, implies that there would be some sort of magic bullet therapy, and we all are individuals. But we often say on our podcast, one of our taglines is "You are your own primary healthcare provider." But in this case, it would make sense that the parent would be the primary healthcare provider for an autistic child, certainly.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And the one thing, I've had many conversations with people in this community who work with kids on the spectrum. The one thing that is the most important tool or asset that a parent can have on this journey trying to heal their child is the mindset that it's possible. Just literally knowing it's possible and just setting their intention on that and setting their sights on that, that is the single most powerful thing. Because what happens is these parents will hear from, their ABA therapist or their teachers or the society at large that, like, you just need to embrace your child for who he is. He's just who he is. And, like, you need to move on. And, like, I didn't mean to be so condescending in that, but that's how parents hear it sometimes, that is not what the parents who recover their children hear. They're like, thank you for your well-intentioned advice. My child's body is out of balance and I'm going to do something about it. Mm-hmm. So the mindset of the parent is first and foremost the most important part of that whole formula. And I've been for 15 years, I have never seen a parent who didn't believe it was possible recover their child. It doesn't happen without that parent, I think, driving it.
I think what's most powerful about your approach is the underlying principle or belief that the body can heal, that the body knows how to heal. And what you seem to be doing and what these parents seem to be doing is just optimizing their child's body to heal itself.
Exactly.
To get out of the way. And we take our cues from nature in this. If you think about, say, a beach that's been subjected to an oil spill, remove the oil, and that beach will return to its healthy state. Right. Anything in nature will return to a healthy state, a balanced, healthy state, if we just remove the toxic insult, which is usually man-made.
Right, exactly. I mean, we're part of a natural ecology. Like, how can you not see this generation of children here as these canaries in the coal mine being like, hey, you guys, what you're doing is not working. It's not good for human health. Like, that's literally what they're here telling us. And the parents who wake up to that and acknowledge that, and they clean up the environment, they clean up that oil spill, they have the side effect or the benefit of getting healthy themselves. And then they're like, oh, thank you for telling me, because I had no idea. We're all asleep. We don't know because it's just our culture. So these kids are little messengers, and they're bringing us this gift, this opportunity, and some of us take it and some of us ignore it, or some of us don't have the ability to break out from that cultural narrative to even see it.
Well, I think that's why conversations with folks like you are so important, because you share stories, and really it's story that gets through to people. The success stories, your story, the story of your organization. Beth, I have a question. Because the studies that you've done, the CHIRP study, the flight study, and pointing to antibiotics as one of the the greatest insults that can contribute to this toxic load, how has that discovery and realization changed your perspective on the use of antibiotics in like your life or your child's life? Could you see a circumstance where you would take them, or is it just off the table?
So, I came to that awareness in 2008. Because that was when my child started having symptoms, and I went and did a microbiome test and saw that things were out of whack. And then I was like, oh, it makes sense all of a sudden. Like, so that from that moment on, I was like, antibiotics only in a life-threatening situation. Only. I use natural herbs. I've become like, I have my own like little personal apothecary. I just rely on natural tools that have been taught to me over the years. But I do think that, so I've been talking about the CHIRP study data for a little while now, since we've done the analytics on it, and people are always surprised. And I'm like, how can you be surprised that your microbiome, it's like the seat of your health. Like, how can you be surprised that you're carpet bombing it and then expect everything to be okay? But I think, at least conventional medical doctors who are prescribing the most antibiotics are beginning to pull back a little bit, because they're seeing antibiotic resistance, and they're seeing that the kid comes in for an ear infection, and then they do the augmentin or the next level of broad spectrum antibiotics, and it's not working, and the ear infection's still there, and they're like, maybe I shouldn't prescribe these anymore because antibiotic resistance. So like, they're coming from the angle of antibiotic resistance, probably because that's what sells the broad spectrum antibiotics.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. But they're not necessarily at the microbiome place, although occasionally you're seeing them begin to talk about prescribing probiotics, which may or may not be the best idea, but it's permeating a little bit there. But we really have a long way to go. You do see it in I just saw like a Purdue chicken commercial the other day where they were like, we never put antibiotics in our chicken. Meanwhile, they've been doing it for the last 40 years, but whatever. And like it's getting there, where people are like, oh, is it bad to put antibiotics in animals? Like that's starting to click. So I think we're getting there, but we really have a long way to go because it's still, such a ubiquitous prescription in American culture.
Yeah,
that is a funny observation.
Go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say, well, I can think of some people who would opt to buy the antibiotic chicken at the grocery store, but drop their child off for antibiotics for their ear infection on the same afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's a strange disconnect.
There is, like you said a moment ago about sort of you relying on nature, and the body knows how to heal. That is such an important piece of wisdom that has not made it into the modern American mind. And when it does, it will change things forever. There is so much fear around microbes. People are terrified. I mean, just look at what happened with COVID. People were terrified. So they're terrified, like, oh, my child has a strep infection, and I've got like 6 natural antimicrobials. We're gargling the hell out of that thing. Like, there's no antibiotics for that strep infection, but people are terrified. Ear infection, oh my God, they could lose their hearing, like terrified. Why can't we think instead, cut out the sugar to support the immune system, get outside in the sunlight? Like I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who has pneumonia, and I was like, salt pipe. Get some, salt pipe is? It's like you literally inhale saline into your lungs to help. It's antimicrobial. Salt is antimicrobial. I feel like there's so many natural tools out there. The naturopaths who have been doing this forever are like, oh my God, you guys, can we just use the natural tools already, please? Because we're destroying our bodies with all these chemical, like post-World War II industrial chemicals, when there's so many tools out there that are safer and are not going to destroy the body. If you just lean into nature, you're going to be safer.
Yeah. Well, and the paradigm shift I think we're all waiting for, and some I've heard some argue that this is the biggest psyop that's been perpetuated on the culture, is that when you're sick, like the problem is the solution is something they say in permaculture. If there's a problem, something's out of balance, just like you're saying. But if you're sick, that's I don't know, we're terrified of the word, but it's sort of a good thing. It's like you're saying with these autistic kids, it's like, hey, something's not right here. I need help. It's your warning sign. It's the message. It's the information.
I agree with that. And you hope to hear the little whispers from your body when they're little whispers, right? Before they're cancer or like a severe autoimmune disease or something that's going to debilitate or a stroke. Like those whispers, like a little pain in your back or a little like your shoulder stuck, or that is the gift. That's the gold, because you're like, oh,
correct.
Thank you for telling me something's out of balance. And it's your opportunity at that point to investigate what's out of balance. And like, it's not like we're all perfect at this. It's a journey. Like if I have symptoms that come up, I don't immediately know like, oh, I'm just going to get back into balance. Like it's a journey of learning and discovery, but just knowledge and understanding that the body knows how to heal is like, that would change our culture and how we view health forever.
Agreed. It would change everything. Exactly. That's the message.
Mm-hmm.
Beth, speaking of health, let's bring it back to health, your health in particular. We've got a question that we always ask our guests at the end of the show. What are your non-negotiables, the daily habits that you do to tend to your terrain?
Morning sunlight every day. That's very important to me. I aspire to have to go outside and see the sunlight when the sun's going down, but I don't always do it. But that is my aspiration. Sleep. I protect my sleep like it's my job. That's critically important to me. And food. I don't really compromise on food. I might be annoying to people because I care a lot about food, like going out socially or whatever. I might ask about food. Food's very, very important to me. And another daily habit that I do every day is because I'm obsessed with the microbiome, I'm literally obsessed with it. 2/3 of my book that is about gut microbes. I eat fermented foods or I make my own coconut kefir. Like I eat fermented stuff every day. Like that's a non-negotiable for me. It's always in there.
Let me just dive a little deeper. What does your sleep hygiene look like?
So I try to make sure I'm in bed before 10. I try and keep my lights dim, or I wear blue blocker glasses in the evening. If I had maybe if I had a Zoom call that I had to do at 8 p.m., I might not do it, but I try not to do those. But most of my hygiene is just winding down, turning lights down, blue blockers, in bed by 10. I try not to eat too close to bedtime. What else do I do? And then also again, the morning sunlight is part of and exercise. So morning sunlight and exercise I see as are like my morning gift to that night, because the morning sunlight sets your circadian rhythm. And then the exercise is so good, not just for sleep, but for so many other things. But I see as if I get the exercise during the day, that's going to support my sleep at night. So yeah, those would be my major sleep hygiene things, I think.
I love it. And Beth, where can the listener learn more about you and your work?
So I've got a couple websites. There's epidemicanswers.org, documentinghope.com, which is devoted to our research studies, the CHIRP and flight studies, so if people want to learn more about that. And actually, parents can participate in the CHIRP study starting in April. We have it on pause to reset our system, but in April, that will be available again. We also have an online membership community for parents where they can learn how to do this healing work. We sort of walk them through. We have live Zoom calls, we have community calls, just to be a support system for parents who are on the journey. And you can find that on the Documenting Hope site as well. It's called Healing Together. And we have a conference. We have an annual conference every November, and it's called Adventures in Healing, because that's what they are. They're adventures. And that's in Orlando, November 15th through 17th this year.
Wonderful. And we'll put the links to all that in the show notes. Beth Lambert, thank you for joining us on the Terrain Theory podcast. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure too.
Mike, where are we right now?
We're in the pineal room.
It's the after party in the pineal room. Mike, there's a new ditty. What do you think? Honest opinion.
It's so funny. How many times have you been like, well, I'm not really a musician. You know, these guys are the musicians. You're like knocking out these jams for the pineal room. Folks, how great has Ben?
You know what? Sometimes, listen, you're not the only one who has an antenna that can be hoisted to the sky.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. The after party jams are so good, Ben.
I'm trying to make more space for like musical creativity in my life.
Good for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So just finding that state to be creative.
Mm-hmm. That's all it is, isn't it?
The podcast, the podcast space itself, there is creativity in it, but it's really just conversation. It's having conversation. And then like the editing of the podcast, there's not a ton of actual creativity in it. So
there's artistry.
Yeah.
But I know what you're saying.
Yeah. So I need more creativity in my life.
Yeah.
It might be time for another Dub Traffica album session.
Oh, hell yeah. I'm ready for that. Someone made the point. Who was it? Maybe it was our buddy Scott Hogan. I can't remember. Who's a listener. Shout out Scott. But maybe it wasn't. Stop pointing out Rick Rubin's podcast and how he does have ads, but the ads are created by his team. So like they're auditorially branded. It's not just like flying in whatever brands did. They can't. It's curated, and I thought that would be something we could rock.
Absolutely, even if it's like the make believe product.
Maybe that's a good place to start.
What do you think of Beth?
I'm just so happy that people like her are out there. I mean, I know that they are, but it's wonderful to meet them. She's really doing great work.
What strikes me about Beth is she presents. I want to be careful about how I state this, but she presents as someone coming from almost like a more mainstream, like just very dialed in, very, science and study backed, not really conjecture. Like she didn't deviate from messaging that was backed in what they have found in their studies or what the science shows right now. At the same time, she's clearly pushing against a lot of the common narratives around autism, like it's genetic, or the reason for the increase is just because more people are being tested and more people are falling into the buckets. Like she's willing to take on some of these narratives, but doing it from a place of like science-backed, evidence-based foundation. And she's also just she's so articulate and so able to like tread carefully around some of the landmines that exist when you start talking about things like autism and chronic disease.
Yeah, she's a great spokesperson because she is very comfortable keeping one foot, as we talked about, like in the counterculture and in the culture, to bridge
Yes,
that divide, really.
she's a bridge. She's an incredible bridge for these conversations, and this is, I guess, biased. This was really after the conversation ended. We asked her a little bit more about her perspective on terrain theory, but uh, she knows it. She knows some of the voices that are in this space, and the fact that she takes homeopathy. And if you look at some of the success stories on her website, specifically around these children who have had autism and now no longer have that autism label, or have gone great strides reversing their autism symptoms, there's a number of them who've introduced homeopathy, who
Yeah.
credit homeopathy with a lot of their success.
Yeah, to open up detox pathways in a gentle way. And she actually reminded me a lot of her message reminded me of Zach Bush, which was sort of our gateway into this space early on, because he's all about the microbiome and how we can't even get more antibiotics into our society, just like pumping them up year after year after year. And she was really hitting that hard, and it makes so much sense. And this almost seemed it seems a little crass to say, but like our culture is always harping on diversity as this hot button word, but we don't apply it where it maybe matters most, which is to ourselves as individuals and our microbiome.
Mm.
I mean, that's like, it's just like an esoteric idea to the mainstream.
Yeah, like just the bio individuality
Yeah.
of addressing illness or disease or
Yeah. Even
something like
the
autism.
example you used about the oil spill, it's like you say, well, you go up and you clean up the oil. Well, some people go in and they bring like special fungus in that eats petroleum. And that's the perfect, like a macro example of what the microbiome does.
Yeah,
You bring
yeah.
in the right biota and you return to homeostasis. So micro, macro, as within, so without.
As within, so without. And I think the other piece, and this is nuance, that one size doesn't fit all. That one approach to addressing something like autism might not work
Right.
for every kid.
Which reminded
But
me of Steve Falconer in esoteric biochemistry. And we're all individually made up of the 12 tissue salts in different formations, different combinations. And you need to figure out who you are, where you are, and how to get back to your homeostasis.
which and ties back to a little bit to Daniel Powensky, right? What was happening the moment you took your first breath? What was going on astrologically? I mean, if you really want to go
Of
deep
course.
and find out as much as you can about yourself, introduce that as well.
There it is. We got all the answers here, folks.
But just the accumulation of the toolkit, right? And also, which we love, the message of empowerment, that a diagnosis is not necessarily a life sentence. And maybe not even necessary. Take the word necessarily out of there. Like, no diagnosis is a life sentence.
Right.
And the fact that she and her foundation approach this from that same perspective that we take, which is the body knows how to heal. Like, the body is so intelligent and is always fighting to get back to homeostasis. And we can do things and input things that facilitate that process, or remove things that are hindering that process. But at the end of the day, it's that belief that our bodies are always trying to heal, and they're never attacking us.
Yeah.
They're not fighting us. They're not working against us. They're just sending messages. I think that Mike, this is the other like big conclusion that I'm drawing in this journey, this health odyssey, is that it is the communication with our body that we've lost. Like, we've lost that connection to the ways that our body communicates with us, whether that's like physically or emotionally through our thoughts, that we're not great listeners anymore, or we're not great observers of the signs that our bodies are giving us. And this maybe comes back to the education piece, that we're not taught to be good communicators with our body. What is your body telling you right now?
And if we do, I mean, pain is pretty hard to avoid by and large, but what do we do is we try and suppress it. It's like my stomach hurts. Stop
Right.
hurting. Don't
Right.
ask why it hurts. Stop hurting.
Stop
Take this.
talking. That's like a child coming
it's
up
like-
to you being
yeah,
like,
yeah.
Mama, Pop, and then you just cover its mouth.
Yeah, that's your analogy. We're not good
You
listeners. We just say, shut up and feel better.
One of the things that strikes me about Grayson, this is my 7-year-old, is when he eats, in particular when he has dessert, because everyone loves sweets, or most people love sweets.
Sure.
What I've observed with him, and this happens at birthday parties, is they'll have their meal, and all the kids are waiting for the cake and the ice cream or whatever, and he'll get cake and ice cream, and he'll eat at times like 4 bites, and then he'll push it away, and he'll go, "I'm done." Like he's somehow, and I am trying to learn from him because I don't do that. When I have something in front of me, I'm going to eat everything on the plate, sometimes to my own detriment.
Yeah.
I think this is just being raised in a household with, like we've talked about, 2 brothers, and it's like
2 brothers and 1 pint of Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah, it's like, it's like putting one dog dish down in front of a pack of wolves. Like you eat until it's gone, and you get what you can. But Grayson, like, God bless this kid, knows when he's done. He just doesn't eat to excess. He just goes, "No, that's all I need," and he listens to his body.
So
man,
cool.
I'm trying to take my cues from a 7-year-old.
Well, that's good because he's being raised right. There you go.
Yeah. I'm certainly. Well, of course, because when he leaves half of a piece of cake and ice cream, I'm like, "That's fine, I'll take that."
Do as I say, not as I do.
I don't want that to go to waste. So.
Yeah, exactly. It's not good to waste food. No, I'm right there with you.
But
we could go on.
Just listening to your body, right?
I'll share 2 little success stories with my kids too before we wrap, because I got to go pack the van. Willie had this little sty on his eyelid the other day. It was a little swollen, just like bothersome and red. And I said, "Willie, let's put a little activated charcoal on that." And I made like a little poultice, like just a tiny bit of water, and I just put a tiny. And I heard him say to Ruth yesterday, like, "I think Dad's charcoal worked because it's better now." I was like, "Yes!" Like, boom, score 1 for Dad. And then the other day, his girlfriend had a tummy ache. It was really bothering her, and I was like, "Willie, go get my terahertz wand and just blow." And it's just like a hair dryer. It's like not the weirdest thing. It's like a hair dryer, right? Like, just go blow it on her stomach for 5 or 10 minutes. And they came out of the bathroom. She's like, "Yeah, that thing was amazing." And she felt so much better. I was like, "Yes." 2 in a week. I got 2 in a week.
Dr. Mike.
Yeah, 2 success stories.
It's the marathon. I love it. It's the marathon.
Yeah, it's good.
Marathon Mike. You'll win in the end. You'll win them over. Well, seeing is believing. Experiencing is believing.
Exactly.
So good on you, dude. Good on you for just offering it as an option and then seeing how it plays out. And
not coming on too strong. Right.
But good on them too for just going, "Hey, got to give credit where credit's due."
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, you're raising them right as well, Michael.
Well, thank you. I got a later start because they're a little bit older. I got more catch up to do. But yeah, it's starting to happen. It's starting to, and also as they grow up, they're more mature and more resistant in certain ways, but also they're smarter and they're more closer to being an adult and able to reason and rationalize and all that, and like make decisions that make sense for them. All we can do is provide the information, right?
Correct. No, yeah. Correct. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is one of our series celebrating, acknowledging, recognizing Autism Awareness Month, and hope that you continue to investigate this topic with an open mind like Mike and I are trying to do, and folks like Beth certainly is doing. Remember that nothing you heard here should be taken as medical advice, as neither Mike nor I are medical experts. Remember that you are light, you are love, and you are your primary healthcare provider. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.